Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and if the last few days have been an indication of anything, it's that you shouldn't believe everything you see on the internet. It's why I always encourage everyone watching my videos that you should come up with your own conclusions. Sure, please, hear me out, consider my opinions, I present evidence and I tell you what I think is going on, but always I try to cite the sources that are most relevant in the description below, and again, I encourage you to come up with your own conclusions here. But what we have learned as of late is that the Nintendo Switch 2 is a continued historic success, despite what many have been arguing and believing over these last few months. Over these last few months, there's been an interesting phenomenon that has occurred, and it's existed before, but it seems to have been happening to a greater degree most recently. And that is content creators taking advantage of negative conversations and getting a lot more viewership. When we consider the overall economic climate, we consider the tariff situation, and we consider the increased costs of, yes, the Nintendo Switch 2, there has been a lot of conversation, a lot of anger, a lot of confusion about the Switch 2. And I think it's totally valid to not be happy about increased prices, but what we have seen is that prices have been going up across the board for the entire industry. And so there have been a lot of creators putting out headlines suggesting certain things, oftentimes things that are untrue, like all Switch 2 games being $80, that's not true, but that headline was being pushed. Why was it being pushed even though it wasn't true? Many seem to think that there were creators out there that didn't care about the truth, but just putting out the headline that would attract the attention. And unfortunately, it is the case that negativity can create the most amount of engagement and clicks, which does lead to the most amount of views. So over these last few months of the Switch 2 era, there has been this new wave of Switch 2 hate grifters that have gained quite a following. And all of these people have been highly critical of Nintendo, only critical of Nintendo, suggesting many things that are misleading, untrue, some things that are valid, let's be clear, because there is no such thing as perfection, but also predicting as if it's an obvious prediction that the Switch 2 is going to fail miserably and perhaps flop something like Nintendo's worst performing console of all time, the Wii U. And the fact of the matter is, that can't be further from the truth. The Switch 2 is actually, currently, the fastest selling video game console of all time. Things are just looking up and up for Nintendo, which does suggest some pretty exciting things that I want to get into today. Now before going forward, I would like to point out that I do have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos, I would very much appreciate your support. Subscribing if you haven't already, liking, hyping, it all makes a big difference, but at the very least I would like to thank you for coming by to watch today's video. So last week we got an update from Nintendo about their financials, and we learned that the Switch 2, as of September 30th, 2025, has sold 10.36 million hardware units, and also 20.62 software units. And also, the Switch 1 is very close to becoming Nintendo's best-selling console of all time. We look at the DS sales, 154.02, Switch 1, 154.01. It is so close, and almost certainly by this point, even though Nintendo hasn't reported that data, the Switch 1 has outsold the Nintendo DS lifetime. And so, in less than 4 months, because the Switch 2 came out June 5th, so the rest of June, July, August, and September, so a few days shy of 4 months, the Switch 2 has sold 10.36 million units. And this is extremely interesting. This is actually a pretty darn high number. For some perspective, as said here by Polygon, Nintendo said its new console had sold 10.36 million units in the first 4 months between its June launch date and September 30th. It is selling twice as fast as a Switch, which managed 4.7 million units over the equivalent period. PlayStation 5 sold 7.8 million during its first 2 quarters and took 8 months to reach 10 million sales and become Sony's fastest selling console ever, narrowly ahead of the PlayStation 4. And so with these numbers here, we are seeing that the Switch 2 is currently the fastest selling console of all time. So to make the argument that the Nintendo Switch 2 is a surefire flop, it's just so completely off and wrong, it's ridiculous. To think that the Switch 2 is positioned to be a failure, it's literally the opposite. We're talking about one of the greatest successes of all time. We don't need the Switch 2 to be this successful. If the Switch 2 had sold a few million less, we'd still be talking about how the Switch 2 is a great success. And yet here we are, with less than 4 months of sales, the Switch 2 has already eclipsed 10 million systems sold. But something else I think is interesting to point out here when looking at the financials. Nintendo also talked about Switch 1 sales, and as you see here, for this fiscal year so far, we're actually seeing a pretty drastic drop-off in sales, which makes sense. The Switch 2 is out, people prefer that console, and interest in the Switch 1 is waning. But notice how there's a significant hardware drop-off here, but software is only dropped by a little bit. So software is still pretty strong. It still makes sense to support the Switch 1, and also, yes, Switch 1 games still can be played on Switch 2. That's a big reason why Nintendo's continually pushing the Switch 2 editions, because it's encouraging more people to pick up Switch 1 games so they can play them not just on their Switch 1s, but also their Switch 2s with improvements and new content. But this is where things get even more interesting, and there's even more to talk about beyond this, but Nintendo has updated their forecast. They had initially forecasted 15 million units for their fiscal year, which would end at the end of March of 2026. So not even in an entire calendar year, they are anticipating 15 million Switch 2s to be sold, which is actually a pretty impressive number. We'll speak on that in a moment here. But they have now updated that forecast with their recently reported sales to 19 million. They've upped it by an additional 4 million. So they expect that by the end of March of 2026, they're going to sell another 9 million systems. But even beyond that, they're actually upping their forecast for software sales a little bit, not by as much, but they are. And they are updating their forecast for software sales on Switch 1 as well. So they are seeing that software is performing better than they expected for both Switch 2 and Switch 1, which is great. The one thing that they are now forecasting is going to be worse than they expected is the hardware sales of Switch 1. There's been more of a drop-off than they were planning. It's just 500,000 units, so I don't know if I want to go so far as to say that Nintendo made a mistake by taking as long as they did to get out Switch 2, but I think it does go to show that it's definitely time for Switch 2, and if Nintendo waited longer, it could have become problematic. But these numbers are more impressive when we take into consideration that Nintendo had a lot of concerns regarding the whole tariff situation. With the tariffs and increased costs and having the price of Switch 2 as is, Nintendo has definitely been concerned about their sales, and perhaps that's some of the reason why we've seen a lot of content creators calling for the Switch 2 to be a commercial flop because of the increased prices. But despite all of this economic turmoil, the Switch 2 has performed extremely well to the point where Nintendo is updating their forecast to be significantly higher. But for extra perspective here, Nintendo wasn't even expecting the Switch 2 to perform poorly. 15 million would still have been a great number. As IGN notes here, if Switch 2 hits 15 million in its first year, it would go down as one of the biggest console launches of all time and would exceed the OG Switch's 14.87 million sold year 1. So take a look at this. This is sales for year 1, year by year, and quarter by quarter. So in the first month that Switch 1 was out, because it came out March 3rd, by the end of March 31st of that same month, they had sold 2.7 million Switch 1s. But by the end of December 31st of 2017, so for that year of 2017, they sold a total of 14.86 million units. So in about 10 months' time, they would be just shy of 15 million. Nintendo's conservative forecast for Switch 2 was to sell 15 million between the months of June 5th through March 31st of 2026, which would be about 9 months minus a few days. So in less time, during this trying economic time where Nintendo felt compelled to be very conservative, they still forecasted that the Switch 2 would slightly outsell, in a slightly short amount of time, the Switch 1, which is positioned to become not only the best-selling Nintendo console of all time, but perhaps in a year or two, straight up the best-selling video game console of all time. And now Nintendo is upping that forecast by 4 million. That's extremely impressive, and that bodes extremely well. And yet, there's even more to this. So recently, Paul Gale Network, who is known to report ahead of time on sales numbers and be totally accurate, the Switch 2 going into this weekend that just passed had sold 12 million units worldwide. I suppose 2 million for basically the month of October and a little bit of November. That's pretty good. The launch of Pokemon Legends ZA and Super Mario Galaxy 1+2 and all the bundles and stuff that were coming out during that time, I'm sure contributed to that. But now going to the holidays with most of November, Black Friday, then December and Christmas and all of that, the period of time that is historically known to be the strongest sales period for pretty much any game company or just companies in general, the Switch 2 has an opportunity to really pick up on significantly more sales here. Let's go back to Switch 1 sales from 2017 just to get some perspective here. The Switch 1, as of September 30th, 2017, had sold 7.63 million units. The Switch 2, as of September 30th, 2025, has sold over 10 million units. And it's been out for less time, as we've talked about, selling even faster. But with that next quarter, Switch 1 sales almost doubled. So what are we going to see from these holiday sales for Switch 2? How much better is it going to sell? We've talked about during this period of time, Nintendo's been really killing it in terms of their games and constant announcements. We've had Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, and there was all the conversation around that, which overlapped into all the marketing with Pokemon Legends ZA, which is then overlapped into Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, which is now overlapping into Kirby Air Riders, and then Metroid Prime 4. And we've seen a lot of interesting announcements during this period of time as well, like we've gotten the DLC trailer for Pokemon Legends ZA, they've had this massive announcement regarding Animal Crossing. There are more announcements coming. There's been a lot of conversation about Nintendo during this period of time. They are maintaining the momentum, they are really pushing things here. The Switch 2 is likely going to become even more successful, and I would not be totally shocked if Nintendo ends up actually having to improve their forecast again, and they exceed 19 million units by the end of March of 2026, which would be a crazy number to hit, less than a year out, having sold over 20 million units, but it is seeming perhaps pretty plausible, and actually might be pretty important because we have heard that Pokemon Generation 10, which according to the leaks we've seen documentation of, they plan on using a whole new engine for. At least a few years ago, it was planned to be a Switch 2 exclusive. So selling 20 plus million units in the first 9 months or so of Switch 2, I think, could be big for this because Pokemon Company and Game Freak likely want to have some pretty strong sales for their new generation of Pokemon. So having as many people as possible owning a Switch 2 would certainly make for a big difference there. Now, what's also interesting about this is that simply announcing an exclusive Pokemon game, a new generation of Pokemon game, which sell better than the Legends games and Let's Go Pikachus and such, they're bigger sellers, and it would be Generation 10 for the 30th anniversary of Pokemon, supposedly using a new, more ambitious engine, which the fan base has been calling for a very long time. That could lead to some pretty explosive sales, not just for Generation 10, but for Switch 2s. And we still have yet to see the next Smash Brothers, the next 3D Mario, the next Animal Crossing, the next mainline new Zelda for this console. Nintendo still has a lot of cards to still play here, and we're already off to such a great start for Switch 2. To argue otherwise is to be in denial, or you're lying for some sort of a weird ulterior motive. Things are going really well for Nintendo right now, so maybe all those negativity Switch 2 grifters should just keep at it, because for whatever reason, even though it may lead some people to think that things are going poorly, they're not. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.